Welcome to episode 75 of Tales from the Hangman's Record. My name is Steve Fielding. All these stories are taken from my 3-volume series of books, The Hangman's Record, covering every execution in Great Britain and Ireland between 1868 and 1964. Copies of these and many of my other titles can be obtained through my website, stevefielding.com. If you enjoy the video, can you spare £1 or £2 to help the channel continue to grow? Donations can be made by clicking the thanks button on the YouTube video or with the link paypal.me/thehangmansrecord. Use the comments below for your thoughts on the case, whether justice was seen to be done, and suggestions for further episodes in this series. World War I was probably the most horrific war in history. Beginning barely a dozen years after the end of the Boer War, what started out as another battle with soldiers still on horseback quickly escalated to mechanical warfare, with gun carriages pulled by motor vehicles, repeat-firing machine guns and the first tanks. By the end of the war, aeroplanes were engaged in dogfights over the battlefield, and along with Zeppelin airships were dropping bombs in enemy territory. It was also the first war to use chemical warfare, with the introduction of the deadly chlorine and mustard gas. For soldiers conscripted from civilian life to be taken to brutal training camps before being sent to the front, well aware of the horrors that awaited them through blanket press coverage, it was often too much. Shell shock wasn't recognised, and as a result, many soldiers were shot at dawn, unfairly labelled cowards while suffering from that terrible condition. Some soldiers who had witnessed the horrors of war decided to desert, and today's tale from the Hangman's Record is a story of two such men. Fleeing the battlefields of France, they headed to the Scottish city of Glasgow, lying low and living in the shadows, hiding from authority and forced into crime to survive. They lived off the money from theft, street gambling and vice, and it was this latter, luring unsuspecting victims into a liaison with one of their prostitutes, that was to see them commit a brutal murder after using a honey trap to snag their prey. "35-year-old bachelor Henry Sr. lived with his brother Thomas and widowed mother Jane on Robson Street, Govan Hill, on the southern side of Glasgow, Scotland. A veteran of the Great War, Senior had enlisted in 1914 and was with the 11th Hussars until he was badly wounded in April 1918. Repatriated back to Scotland, he was admitted to the Oakbank Military Hospital and was still recuperating when the armistice was signed. Following an honourable discharge from the army, he was returned to civilian life and his former occupation as a stonemason. At 7 o'clock on Tuesday evening, the 3rd of February 1920, Senior finished his shift at the quarry, had a hot bath, and after dressing in his best suit and top coat, told his brother he had a date with a redhead from Fife and they were going to the Pavilion Theatre. As he prepared to leave, Thomas asked if he had enough money. Henry opened his wallet and revealed 14 £1 notes. "You don't want to be carrying so much," he warned. Heeding the advice, he took £10 out, placed them on the mantelpiece and left the house. Senior met his date in Hope Street near Argyle Street and they made their way to the theatre. After the curtain came down, the couple left and at her suggestion boarded a tram in Glasford Street and headed south towards Mount Florida and Queen's Park. As the crowds from the theatre spilled out shortly after 10 o'clock, Senior had on his arm 22-year-old Helen White. He had met her on the previous evening and they had arranged a night out. Unknown to him, he had been set up. Helen was a small-time prostitute who had selected him as her target on the advice of her pimps and was acting out a pre-arranged scenario. Several times in the last month she had been in similar situations. A few seats behind them on the tram as they headed towards the park sat a pair of army deserters who watched and waited. 24-year-old Albert James Fraser was on the run from his native Australian army, while his companion, 23-year-old Belfast-born James Rollins, had absconded from the British Army at the height of hostilities. Both made a living off the immoral earnings of their girls, and they also supplemented this income by mugging and stealing from the clients. They alighted adjacent to Queen's Park Recreational Ground, a popular nighttime destination for courting couples, and arm in arm walked into the park. Because the weather was cold and blustery, the park was almost deserted, but Helen led Senior to a grass verge hidden by some tall bushes. The couple sat down on the grass, close to a wooden fence, when two men suddenly appeared from behind the bushes. Senior felt a punch to the head, followed by the barrel of a gun thrust into his back. "Hand over your wallet," Fraser hissed. It was a well-rehearsed routine. The man would hand over the money, and then, too ashamed to contact the police, would shuffle home, poorer but wiser. Dazed by the blow, Senior climbed to his feet and protested at the unwelcome intrusion. They again demanded his wallet, but the former soldier was not easily intimidated and began to square up to the two men. Not expecting Senior's resistance, Fraser prodded the revolver into his chest and threatened to shoot. At the same moment, Rollins appeared from behind, put his arm around his neck and attempted to force him to the ground. As the man began to struggle, Fraser struck him several times in the face with the butt of the pistol while Rollins squeezed his neck. Helen White begged them to stop, but both were fired up and took no heed of her plea, telling her to beat it. The tearful girl turned on her heel and walked away. As Senior lay on the ground, the men rummaged through his pockets where they found a handful of change. They continued to beat the man unconscious and then removed the trouser pocket with a knife. Disappointed with their haul, Fraser removed Senior's boots, hoping to find more money secreted inside. But failing to find any more cash, he decided to steal the man's boots, stuffing them into the two side pockets of his overcoat. Fraser then removed Senior's coat before leaving the park and catching a tram on nearby Cathcart Road back to their lodgings. They met up again with Helen White on the following morning, who was given Senior's blood-soaked overcoat and instructed to wash it, which he did before pawning it later that day. The three then met up with Elizabeth Stewart, Rollins' girlfriend, and after which the two women went on to the cinema in Argyle Street. However, their film was interrupted not long afterwards by the two men, frantically trying to get the girl's attention by waving a newspaper. The paper contained the news that Senior was dead, and the four decided they would flee to Ireland. The total of their haul brought them just £2, a value of around £100 in 2025. Wednesday the 4th of February had broken a typical cold Glasgow morning, but it didn't stop two 9-year-old boys, students at the nearby Deaf and Dumb Institute, from heading onto Queen's Park Recreation Ground to kick around a football. Presently one of the boys overhit his shot, causing it to disappear into a clump of bushes. His friend dashed off to receive it, and as he bent down to pick up the ball, he recoiled in horror. The ball was lying beside the dead body of a man. The two boys rushed back to the institute with news of their gruesome find and to raise the alarm. Soon the park was swarming with police, charged first with identifying the victim of what had clearly been a vicious attack. There were no personal papers or identification located on the body, whose face was so badly beaten it was completely beyond identification. Detectives noted that the man's boots had been removed and both trouser pockets cut away with a knife rather than just turned out, clearly suggesting robbery as the motive. An ambulance removed the body to the mortuary attached to the nearby Queen's Park police station, and a search of the surrounding area began. Officers from Glasgow CID, led by Detective Superintendent Andrew Keith, were called in and a murder inquiry set up. The police soon had a positive identification. The story had made headlines of the afternoon papers. Senior's mother, having read reports of the grisly find, went to the police to report her son missing after he failed to return home on Tuesday night and was still not back by Wednesday lunchtime. Due to the severity of the injuries to Senior's body and face, officers were reluctant to let his mother view the body, so another officer went to collect his brother to see if he could formally identify the body and spare his mother the trauma. With a positive identification made, police learned from Jane Senior that her son had left home around 7:30 on Tuesday night to meet a girl from Fife. From descriptions of what her son had on him when he left the house that Tuesday, the police were able to tell the newspapers they were looking for several items, including a pair of brown boots, an overcoat, some money and his army discharge papers. The clues soon began to arrive. A tram conductor came forward claiming that two men had boarded his car at around 9:45 on the night of the murder on Cathcart Road, just yards from the scene of the crime. One of the men the conductor remembered had a pair of boots sticking from his pockets of an overcoat, while the other man's hands were stained with blood. The conductor was able to provide descriptions of both men and state they both departed the tram in the city centre on Gordon Street next to Central Station. The police were quick to match the tram conductor's description with two men suspected of committing a string of recent violent attacks in the park. Acting on information received, detectives visited numerous addresses in the Govan Hill area. No arrests were made, but certain leads took the case in an unexpected direction. On Saturday the 7th of February, the funeral of Henry Sr. took place at Cathcart Cemetery, just 2 miles from the scene of the murder. A large crowd looked on as the body was interred. His brother Charles read the brief committal, and his coffin was carried into church by Charles and his 2 other brothers, Joseph and Thomas. As the funeral was underway in Glasgow, Detective Chief Inspector Keith and Detective Inspector Louis Noble were heading by boat to Belfast. The journey came about after detectives received a tip-off suggesting that the 2 men fitting the description of the wanted men had been spotted at Glasgow Central Station boarding a boat train bound for Ireland. A man spoke to detectives and told them of 2 men named Rollins and Fraser, who were living off immoral earnings of prostitutes. He also gave the officers an accurate description of both men, so accurate in fact that all the detectives had to do was to find them. The informant also told detectives that he had once heard Fraser say that if he ever had to lie low, he knew the very place, a cave on Cave Hill on the outskirts of Belfast. The 2 deserters had hidden here before when the heat was on. Once in the province, the Glasgow detectives sought the assistance of the local police, who had information that the men they sought were staying in a boarding house in the east side of the city. Chief Inspector Keith asked that the area was placed under discreet observation, and for the next few hours the Belfast and Glasgow detectives combed the city streets hunting for the killers. In the late afternoon, wet from the relentless drizzle, the Chief Inspector returned to his room and pondered his next move. After lunch he was back on the streets with an officer from Belfast CID. The 2 detectives were walking along Albert Bridge Road when they saw 2 men answering the murderer's description. Keith watched them and decided to take a closer look. Taking a cigarette from his pocket, he stuck it between his lips and approached. He asked them for a light and looked into their faces as one reached into his pocket for a match. He then spoke quietly. "I am looking for 2 men for a murder in Glasgow." Fraser spoke. His Australian accent was so far removed from the local brogue that Keith knew he was onto something. The man told him he was mistaken, but they both agreed to accompany the officers back to the station. The men gave their names as Albert James Fraser and James Rollins. They were stripped of their clothing, which was carefully examined for bloodstains. There was no obvious marks, but Keith noticed that Fraser's jacket appeared to have been washed. He slit open the seams of the sleeve and he found signs of blood. In Rollins's pocket was a piece of paper with an address in Lord Street. The detectives went to the house and found it belonged to a relative of Rollins. While they were making a search, there was a knock on the door. Opening it, officers were faced with 2 young women, who said that not only did they live here, but their names were Gladys Renton and Elizabeth Stewart, and they were Fraser and Rollins' girlfriends. When told of the murder, both women were upset and told the detectives that they'd been hiding out in a cave on Cave Hill outside Belfast. It was soon clear that the 4 persons detained were those responsible for the Glasgow murder, and they were arrested on suspicion of murder and returned to Scotland. The 4 prisoners arrived on the Sunday morning boat train from Belfast, accompanied by the 2 Glasgow detectives, 2 Belfast detectives and 2 female prison warders. Despite the early hour of their arrival, crowds had already begun to assemble at Central Station jeering as the prisoners were bundled into the police van. In the following week, the four appeared at Glasgow Police Court. The two men were named as Albert James Fraser, a 24-year-old deserter from the Australian Army, and Jimmy Rollins, a 22-year-old Irishman, a deserter from the Irish Guards. They sat together in the dock, appearing undaunted by the proceedings, laughing and joking with each other, clearly enjoying the fact that they were the centre of everyone's attention. Following their return, the two women were charged with being accomplices in the crime, but shortly afterwards, both were released, with Helen White to become the principal witness for the Crown in the murder trial. By the time the case came to the High Court on Tuesday the 4th of May 1920, before Lord Sands, both women had turned King's evidence and were to be the prosecution's chief witnesses. Fraser and Rollins faced a murder charge and 3 assault and robbery charges. First into the dock was Helen White. The court heard she had married a Canadian soldier during the war, and when he returned to his unit, she took up with Fraser. She told how that on the night of the murder, she went with Fraser into the city where they met Rollins in Hope Street. After talking for a while, the two accused had told her to meet her date and that they would follow up. Once she had lured Senior to the park, Fraser and Rollins had followed discreetly, and despite her pleas for them to show mercy, the prisoners had kicked the man to death. Recalling the attack, White collapsed in the witness box and had to be carried from the court. 18-year-old Elizabeth Stewart was next to be called. She told the court how she shared a house with Rollins, Fraser and Helen White. She also lured men to Queen's Park, but hadn't done so on the night of the murder. Stewart claimed she had been home all night, and when the men returned, she asked where Rollins had got the clothing and boots from. He told her they were from a man they had done in. She helped clean the coat and boots, and on the following morning took both items to a pawn shop. As the trial drew to a close, Rollins' counsel rose to his feet and told the jury that he wouldn't insult their intelligence by asking for a verdict of not guilty. He would, instead, ask that they found them guilty of culpable homicide, because the accused had gone to the park with the intention to commit robbery but not murder. This would mean a life sentence instead of execution should the jury return with this verdict. The trial lasted 2 days, and after just 20 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict of guilty of murder. Told to stand, the judge told the prisoners they had been convicted of an atrocious murder and that there was only one duty devolving upon him. With a black cap draped on his wig, he sentenced the pair to death, immediately fixing the date of Wednesday, the 26th of May. The two women on whose testimonies they had been convicted were released on a special warrant. On hearing the verdict, the men turned to each other, smiled and shook hands. Fraser pretended to wipe a tear from his eye in an exaggerated manner, while Rollins drew a finger across his throat and pointed up to the sky. An appeal was launched for the death sentence to be commuted to life imprisonment, with the lawyers again arguing that the two men had entered the park with no intention of committing murder, only assault and robbery. The appeal was denied. On Tuesday the 25th of May, Hangman John Ellis and his assistant, William Willis, arrived in Duke Street just in time to see the prisoners take exercise together. Standing at the door of the exercise yard, watching the two men stroll in the warm spring sunshine, they believed they would not be noticed. However, Willis recorded that as Fraser passed, he turned and called to his partner in crime, "Jimmy, there's that fellow Ellis." Returning to their quarters, the hangmen were given the information that Fraser stood a half-inch under 6 foot and weighed 186 pounds, with Rollins 5'10" and 14 pounds lighter. Fraser was to be given a drop of 6'6" and Rollins a slightly longer drop of 7 foot. Duke Street had a small execution block separate from the main wing, with the condemned cells and a scaffold that magistrates witnessed executions through a glass partition. On the following morning, Fraser and Rollins were awakened at 6 o'clock sharp and served a hearty breakfast. Then, for the first time since their trial, they were permitted to associate in a cell together as they awaited the fateful hour. Fraser was noted to remain buoyant and chatty, while Rollins seemed a little more subdued. As dawn broke, a large crowd had begun to gather outside the prison gates, and anticipating this, there was a strong police presence on duty from 7 o'clock. As the clock ticked away their final minutes, both prisoners were sat together with a short religious ceremony was conducted by the prison chaplain in the condemned cell. On the stroke of 8, the executioners entered. They swiftly pinioned the arms of both men, and again it was Fraser who spoke. "You mean to have me tight, don't you?" he told the hangman, as his wrists were secure behind his back. The pinion straps were not intended to be fastened too tight. The purpose was to merely keep the hands secure so the prisoner could not wriggle his hands free. Fraser and Rollins then walked the short distance from the cell, across the landing to the scaffold. After confirming their identity, they both stepped onto the trapdoor without complaint. Ellis placed a white cap over each man's head and a noose around their necks. As he reached for the lever of the trapdoor, Fraser spoke his final words. "Cheer up, Jimmy," he said as the trapdoors opened beneath their feet. Despite any concerns, there were no demonstrations, and when, a few minutes after 8, a notice appeared on the door of the prison that the executions had been carried out, the crowd dispersed quietly. It was the last double execution in Scotland. Executions continued at Duke Street Prison until August 1928. By the time the next death sentence was carried out in Glasgow in 1946, the gallows had moved across the city to Berlin. Duke Street closed as a jail in 1955 and was demolished by the end of the decade. The execution of Fraser and Rollins was the last double hanging to take place in Scotland. But it was not the last time that Queen's Park would feature prominently in a murder case. 40 years later, another pair of killers would again use one of the oldest tricks in the book to claim their victim. Keep an eye out for this episode in the coming weeks. You'll be watching another episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. Until the next time, thank you and goodbye.